Imagine finding a dusty old book in a locked chest. Its pages promise you the power to command demons, cure any illness, make you rich, and the ability to speak with the dead. Would you dare read it, or rather, would you dare to read it out loud? This is the reality of the grimoires, the magic books, books that contain symbols, incantations, charms and instructions for invocations and for making amulets. Now, to technically understand some of these texts, we first have to understand the history of magic and how grimoires came to be in this world. I shan't lie, it's a little bit complicated, as the overlap between ancient grimoires and medieval responses to them, as well as the role of major religions in their creation and significance of grimoires in religion, is pretty hardcore, and there's a lot of intense detail and overlapping, and it's fascinating, but it also feels as though you're watching the last film of the Avengers franchise, having never seen any of the other films. You know, everyone is here for some reason, but we don't have time to explain why everyone's here or what their role is here, but the reason that they're all here is important. So we'll go over that, and then we'll look at a few famous grimoires and examine why people perceive them as dangerous and terrifying. So first, let's explain the relation between ancient and medieval grimoires. And to do that, I need to introduce a cultural icon. Now, believe it or not, she's a woman, though she's not from ancient Egypt or even ancient Greece, but England during World War II. Her name is Miss Eglantine Price from the film Bedknobs and Broomsticks. In this story, Mrs. Price is a practicing witch whose school of witchcraft, which she's been attending from a distance, has closed due to the war. Frustrated that she will never learn the final spell, the substitutiary locomotion, which I can't say without singing, it's a weird word, the song is always there, but that spell, which she doesn't have to sing apparently, but I have to do anyway, well, she was hoping to learn that spell, hoping to aid the war effort for Britain. So Mrs. Price takes her evacuee children with her on a hunt for a grimoire, the magic spellbook that features the final spell. Of course, she finds a chap in charge of this alleged school, and it turns out to be a hack who had no idea that the magic spells that he was teaching and selling were actually real. She searches his library and finds the book hidden on the shelves, but to her dismay, the page detailing the spell is missing, which is the real reason why the school closed down. So she looks for the missing half of the book, but thankfully it all turns out that the spell is actually engraved on the Star of Astaroth, a medallion that belonged to a sorcerer of the same name. And so the adventure continues. Now, this charming story and wonderful film starring Angela Lansbury showcases the many ways in which magic has been documented since the ancient world, all the way to the medieval period. You see, before there were grimoires, magic was believed to be stored in and produced by symbols, amulets, talisman, and ritual. Now honestly, reading the foundation of ancient to medieval grimoires broke my brain a little bit, because there are so many interconnecting ideas, and you know, Owen Davis, who I use for this video, explains it much better than I do, but I'll do my best to break down and share what I learned. So to start talking about grimoires, I first have to talk about magic. And for that, I have to return to a topic that we covered over a year ago in a video about eating the dead, the Zoroastrians. So the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans believed the first practitioners of magic were the Persian tribal priests, the Zoroastrians. Eudoxus, the ancient Greek astronomer and mathematician, calculated that Zoroaster lived 6,000 years before the death of Plato, meaning that he believed the birth of magic was 6,347 BCE. But Pliny the Elder sort of inserted himself in here to highlight that there should be a distinction made between the birth of magic and when it was first written down. And the first man to write it down, he argued, was Asthanies, the legendary Persian magus and alchemist who accompanied King Xerxes on his unsuccessful war against Greece in 480 BCE. Now, obviously, this way of understanding how magic was quote-unquote written down distills the idea of inscribed magic to that of a page, or technically papyri, whereas we know that magic was inscribed years before that through some of the earliest physical Egyptian artifacts, including amulets, stone monuments, clay tablets, bowls, and other burial objects, all of which are largely apotropaic magic, i.e. protective magic, such as this apotropaic wand from the 12th dynasty, made of hippopotamus ivory, and many archaeologists have found these deliberately broken before being placed in tombs, suggesting there was some attempt to destroy the object's power. In Jewish, Christian and Islamic traditions, magic books date before the age of the flood, and the writer of this first book of magic varies. For Samaritan and Hebrew traditions, the first writer of books was Adam, but in late antiquity and medieval periods, the writer of the first books was believed to be Enoch, or Idris in Arabic, which brings me onto the Book of Enoch, and the point in my reading that I regretted getting into the subject because, oh my god, trying to find sources about religious history detached from religiosity is a pain in the bum, and this was really messy. But the Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish apocalyptic religious text ascribed to Enoch, believe it or not, who was the father of Methuselah and the great-grandfather of Noah. This is why it's important. The Book of Enoch contains details on the origins of demons and Nephilism, explains why some angels fell from heaven, and explains the Genesis flood itself. Now, there's no Hebrew version of this that's known to have survived, but copies of earlier sections of what is now known as 1 Enoch were preserved in the Aramaic along with the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran caves. There's also 2 Enoch and 3 Enoch, but none of them are considered canonical by Jewish or Christian bodies, even though some of 1 Enoch is cited in the Epistle of Jude. The reason why it's relevant to this discussion is that the Book of Enoch contains astrological, astronomical, and angelic lore, and thus the earliest works on occult sciences were read by Enoch according to Christian chronology. Now, Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah, and Noah's sons, Shem and Ham, are associated with the first book on conjuration and magic. Now, obviously, none of these histories of this period are set in stone. There's a lot of conflicting information, as with all good ancient sources. But in some accounts, Ham wrote down the secrets of demonic magic on metal plates and stone tablets before the Great Flood, and he buried them and then returned them once the waters had subsided. But for the Bishop of Norwich in 1119, as well as many others who agreed with him, they believed that Ham secreted the Book of Magic on the Ark during the flood. In other medieval texts, Ham is the father of Zoroaster. In others, he is Zoroaster. And then Michael Scott, no, not that Michael Scott, another Michael Scott, this 12th century abbot, argued that Zoroaster is the one who invented magic, but he was descended from Shem, not Ham. And he argued that Ham was the person who invented the art of divination with the help of demons. It's interesting, there's a lot of magic in early Christianity, which we'll get into more. Speaking of Michael Scott, no, not that Michael Scott, this Michael Scott, he actually translated the Averroes by Ibn Rushd, an Islamic intellectual who I discussed in great detail in my video on Dante's Limbo. I know, the ancient and medieval periods are insanely interconnected in this channel apparently. So Persia was regarded as the origins of magic by many ancient and medieval peoples, but the reason that Zoroaster is often referred to as Chaldean is because the ancient civilization of Chaldea, which was part of Babylonia, was also renowned for its astrological and magical abilities. Ironically, this discussion takes us backwards to the Akkadians, but don't worry, it'll make sense why I discussed the Bible first. Now, the Akkadians, part of the Mesopotamians, are known for being a major repository of magic spells in the form of cuneiform tablets featuring rituals, incantations, spells, basically everything. I talk extensively about their cuneiform tablets in my video on ancient libraries. But why was it that Egypt, rather than Iraq, came to be known to the Greeks, the Romans, the Muslims, the Christians and the Jews as the home of magic in later periods? Now, any experts in the comment section, please let me know down below, but from what I could tell from my basic understanding, it seems to be largely down to timing and circumstance. You see, the Mesopotamian civilization had already declined when the ancient Greeks took interest in Egypt, and because the Greeks were seafaring peoples, Egypt was far more accessible and thus the focus of interest based on ease of access. But you can let me know differently. But let me emphasise how much Egypt was seen as the centre of magic. The Jewish Talmud wrote that 9/10 of the world's sorcery resided in Egypt, and the Greeks and Romans, wishing to learn all about the art of magic and occult knowledge, travelled to Egypt in hopes of learning more, like a pilgrimage as it were. Now, the first period in the development of grimoires is the Hellenistic period, when Egypt was under Greek rule after Alexander the Great's conquest. Here we see an amalgamation of Greek and Egyptian cultures, religion and magic, and the development of Coptic writing system, which is constructed of Greek letters and Egyptian phonetics. The Greco-Egyptian papyri date from the late 1st century BCE to the early 5th century CE, mostly during Roman rule, and they contain a concoction of Greek, Egyptian and Jewish influences, which makes it hard for archaeologists to decipher what magic stems directly from Egyptian culture. This is also where archaeologists have noticed a shift from apotropaic magic, which the ancient Egyptians were known for, to rather self-serving magic, as it were. Magic that centred the magician's success, fortune, sexual and social conquests, etc. But this isn't to say that all magic before this period was apotropaic, which brings me back to the Bible briefly, because we can't ignore Moses. The language around this figure and others such as Jesus is that of a miracle worker, but in terms of ancient magic, their performances were nothing short of traditional. The plague of flies and the turning of the rivers of Egypt red are deeply emblematic of Egyptian occult knowledge, and considering he was raised in the pharaoh's household in Egypt, as well as Greeks such as Celsus writing about how Jewish people were apparently fascinated by sorcery, followed by Romans openly talking about seeking out Jewish magicians under Roman rule, let's just say these miracles are very similar to that which is found in Greco-Egyptian grimoire papyri. Now, I do not have the time or the headspace to get into the grimoire, the 8th book of Moses, and the other lost books of Moses, but let's just say it's obvious why medieval abbots were fascinated with grimoires and the science of magic in the ancient world, because the rivers run deep, and honestly, seeing how these cultures and ideas and imaginations and explorations coexisted in this melting pot before they were brutally splintered apart and trampled upon and fought over just makes me realise how truly ridiculous we really always been. Our ancient desires to always be right and to dominate has historically always killed the magic of humanity. But anyway, let's talk about medieval grimoires. You see, Christian prayers and blessings are integral to magic contained in grimoires, and the sign of the cross, holy water, and consecrated paraphernalia were important defences against accidentally conjuring up demons, like you do on a Friday night. Now, as such, it makes sense why monasteries were important repositories for magic books, with medieval clergy being the main practitioners, transcribers, owners, and circulators of magic and grimoires. But the church didn't have monopoly on grimoires. European universities were also core centres of grimoire production and consumption. The Key of Solomon, also known as Clavicula Solemnis, is a pseudo-epigraphical grimoire, attributed, believe it or not, to King Solomon. The earliest versions are written in Greek in the 15th century and bore the titles Magical Treatise of Solomon or The Little Key of the Whole Art of Hygromancy. By the time they were translated into Latin and Italian, the term clavicula was being used. There isn't a definitive edition of the clavicule, and there's no substantive evidence of a Hebrew version existing before the 17th century, despite many of them claiming to have been translated from Hebrew. Most of the texts contain symbols and rituals for personal rather than spiritual reasons, and they included things such as controlling angels of darkness, provoking love, becoming invisible, punishing enemies, and dealing with thieves. Now, Michael Scott, no, not that Michael Scott, this Michael Scott, he was a Scottish clergyman who lived between 1175 and circa 1232. He was a critic of magic. However, he was proficient in translating Hebrew and Arabic and translated some of the works of Aristotle. Now, during his time at Toledo Cathedral in Spain, rumours began to circulate that he learned the secrets of necromancy. This rumour lived on so long that in the 15th century, books bearing his name began to circulate, attributing him to the demonological invocations and instructions on how to conjure familiar spirits. By the 16th century or 17th century, a grimoire titled Michael Scott's Magic Book existed in John Ryland's library in Manchester, meaning the critic of magic had become a wizardry figure centuries later, all due to a random rumour. Now, the medieval clergy were allowed to be in possession of these texts, but normal folks were not, and were they to be seen practising from these texts, they faced punishment. In England, in 1466, Robert Barker of Cambridgeshire was brought before the bishop for possessing a book of black art, featuring circles, exorcisms, and conjurations, a hexagonal sheet with strange figures, 6 metal plates with diverse characters, a chart with hexagonal and pentagonal figures, and a gilded wand. It was believed that all of this was to aid him in conjuring up a demon who would help him treasure hunt. For this, he was made to walk around Ely and Cambridge barefoot, carrying his magic books and paraphernalia, which were all burned in the marketplace. The 15th century astronomer Henry the Bohemian, likely under torture, also confessed to having summoned demons to help him find buried treasure in the Royal Zoological Garden in Poland, and he accused the same of 2 professors of Krakow University. The Grand Grimoire, also known later as Le Dragon Rouge, was the first diabolic mass-market grimoire. The first edition had been dated to 1702, but Owen Davies believes that its absence of sources during the early 18th century would mean its first edition was actually more around 1750. The grimoire gave explicit instructions on how to summon and make a pact with the devil's prime minister in hell, Lucifer Rofocal. And yes, I did say Prime Minister, as this book detailed the hierarchy in hell. We had Lucifer, who was the emperor, Beelzebub, who was the prince, Astaroth, I know there he is, he was the Grand Duke, Lucifer Rofocal was the Prime Minister, Satantia was the Commander-in-Chief, Agalia Rept was the Commandant, Fleureti was the Lieutenant General, Sagittanas was the Brigadier Major, and at the bottom was Nibiros, the Marshal and Inspector General. Now, because Lucifer had given Lucifer Guy power over the riches of all of the world, he was the one that people summoned when they wanted to go treasure hunting. And it was largely believed that if you possessed a copy of this grimoire, you had already made a pact with the devil. In 1804, when a man in Amiens was found in possession of a grimoire, likely the Grand Grimoire, he played a bit of a trick on government officials. You see, he claimed that he could summon the devil by merely touching the book, but when an official opened the book and began reciting bits, nothing happened. Now, for the official, he was trying to prove that the book was utter nonsense, but the man exclaimed that the official was an incredibly skilled magician, more so than he, because the official was able to silence Satan. Magic flourished during the Revolution in France, with the rise of anti-clericalism. Interestingly, over a century and a half later, a new version of the Grand Grimoire, titled now Le Dragon Rouge, was published by an evangelical campaigner. He wrote, quote, "After the French Revolution in 1789, a revolution aimed at dethroning God and enthroning the goddess of reason, this particular book, The Fiery Dragon, became a sinister substitute to the Bible for some French magic circles." The Dragon Rouge became a popular bookshop purchase in the early 19th century, selling hundreds of copies, and by then the book was seen to many as a rather amusing text, though for others they were still wary. And those same people exist today. Some people will not touch a grimoire or read from it. I really enjoyed going through this. I highly recommend it. I will link it down below. And thank you as always for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you as always to my Patreons for making this possible. And thank you in particular to my librarians, my main patrons. We have Lady of the Labyrinth, we have Ellen, Ashley Nicole, Eric Taylor, Yvonne and Yvonne, Cody Martin, Jenny Edivade, Marina, Psycho Teddy, Fritz Anderson, Wee Lauren, Andrea Bazil, and Nicholas Reed. Thank you all so much. And I hope you are happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives. So keep reading.